Tonight I'm going to do one of the first things that every preacher is told not to do when arranging the structure of a sermon. I'm going to say the same thing 3 times. My points, they're different, but they all amount to pretty much the same thing. Let go and let God. Now, I know that slogan, such as it is, has a mixed legacy in the church. It's been used to justify inactivity or complacency. Like, oh no, we don't need to do anything because God will do it. It's been used to define an unhelpful oversimplicity, a refusal to deal with difficult questions of human responsibility. But before we throw it in the bin with all our "What Would Jesus Do" bracelets, I think these verses will show us that there's something to it after all. We're going to look at 3 commands of Peter to the suffering church in these verses. 3 things that we are to do. Submit yourselves. Humble yourselves. Cast yourselves. So firstly, and this is in the first part of verse 5, submit yourselves. Now, if you've been following, if you remember where we've been so far in 1 Peter, you know that this isn't the first time in this letter that Peter has made this point. I think it's because it's so important and it's so difficult. That's why he needs to repeat it, because he knows he's saying this is a hard thing to do. So far, Peter's shown what kind of shepherds the flock needs to function, and now he describes how the sheep should behave. And he says, submit yourselves. He addresses, you notice that, the young in particular, because they're the ones most likely to resist the leadership and advice of the older. Now, elders here, like we saw, it probably applies to pastors. Although it's true that more generally in the church and in life, we ought to refer to and respect older believers, like in 1 Timothy 5, 1-2, which says to treat older men as fathers and older women as mothers. Now, that was Paul who wrote those words in Timothy. That's a Jewish man. According to the 5th commandment, how are we supposed to treat our fathers and mothers? With honor. We show them respect. Peter raises this here in this letter at this point, because it's, I think, a very vital stage, and especially addressing young people, because let's look at a few reasons. Suffering will likely cause younger people to question leadership that isn't getting rid of the suffering. Younger people are generally more concerned with peer pressure. It's quite nice, isn't it? The older you get, the less you care what people think about you. And that can be a problem, but it's also a bit of an asset. I feel there's probably a sweet spot somewhere in the middle where we're not going out of our way to offend people or make their lives difficult, but we're also not unduly pressurized by wanting people to like us too much. But it's true, isn't it, that if the church is suffering, then young people will question leadership if the leadership isn't making that suffering go away. That seems natural. Another one is that when we start having a hard time, we automatically, don't we, start looking for someone to blame. We don't usually blame ourselves first, and as believers, we don't really like to put it at God's door. So church leaders make obvious targets. And especially as we have this idea, which isn't wrong really, that these people, elders, pastors, are the people that we take our problems to because they can help. So when there's a problem that we're experiencing as a church and the elders aren't making it go away, well, it seems like, there's something wrong there. And so we're inclined to resist their leadership. We don't want to go in the directions that they're taking us. Another point is that younger people often have the passion and energy to do things, but they don't have the experience that might temper that. Church leaders might often be seen as holding us back in some way. Because, we come up with this great idea, and they say, no, I don't think we should do that. And you're like, but why not? I want to serve the Lord, and they're not wanting to do that. They're resisting God. Human pride will always tempt us to rebel against any authority. And as we saw, pastors have a real authority. So we've got a pile of reasons why all of us in the church, and especially the younger people, will be wanting to sort of rebel against leaders, not submit to them. But a suffering church already has enough problems from outside without sheep causing trouble from inside. Submitting, and this, I've said it's hard already, I'm going to say it again. Submitting is hard. Submitting to leaders demands faith in God. Because, like we've seen, trust can be misplaced, can't it? And authority can be abused. But we should, generally speaking, submit to those God has given us as leaders and as more experienced Christians, if nothing else, then for the sake of peace in the church. And sometimes we get the idea that, well, I'll submit to them as long as I think they're right. But Peter isn't just saying submit to them when you kind of agree with them anyway, because that's not submission, is it? That's just going along with. Submitting, it's suggesting that you're submitting even when there's a kind of resistance in you where you don't want to. Now, I'm not saying that we need to submit in obvious cases of abuse. There's a time to reject unbiblical authority, but within a church where God has put older, more experienced Christians above us in some sense, then we're to submit even when we think they've made the wrong call. If it's not something outrageous, if it's not something clearly unbiblical, if there's not some scripture that they're rebelling against themselves, then we should submit to them, even if we're in disagreement. This is how the church is held together. Will we submit ourselves to our elders? Will we submit to the experience of those who've been Christians longer than us? Will we trust God in the people he's put over us? Well, secondly, humble yourselves. This command is in the second half of verse 5 and in verse 6. Humble yourselves. Now, submit and humble are dirty words today, at least as verbs. They make us think, don't they, of zealots in hair shirts whipping themselves in the mud. Or maybe you think of the Uriah Heeps. I'm ever so humble. They're people who let you know quite how humble they are. And that's unattractive, isn't it? I want to point this out. Peter's command to humble yourselves isn't a command to fill yourself with shame and self-loathing. That's not humility. It's a different kind of pride. I think it's been attributed to C.S. Lewis and all sorts. Who knows if he said it. But there's that wonderful description of humility, isn't it? Humility, I should have written this down because I'm trying to remember it and I'll get it wrong. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. The humility Peter wants us to see in the church is the same thing that he's been recommending all through this letter. Christ imitation. When he says in verse 5, clothe yourselves, he's using the same word that John used in his gospel in chapter 13 when he described Jesus wrapping the towel around his waist to wash the disciples' feet. Clothe yourselves. Humility, it's the same attitude that Paul commended in Philippians 2 when he said, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature or the very form of a servant. Again, I'm just kind of stepping to the side here, thinking like, how do people who deny the deity of Christ get around that verse? Sorry, I'm not preaching this verse, but it struck me now. How can you read Philippians 2, 5-7 and not see that it says, who being in very nature God, so they've probably got a translation that changes that a bit, but then did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, rather he made himself nothing. That means nothing if Jesus isn't God. I'm just struck by it again. Anyway, humility, that's what we're talking about. Humility should be an attitude, shouldn't it, that we wrap ourselves with to serve others. It's not about pushing ourselves down and making ourselves small. It's about lifting others up. It's an outward act. It's a love and deference for others. This is why it's not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. If you think about other people more, well, you think about yourself less, don't you? It's a consideration of their needs. It's a desire to serve them. It's following through, living out love towards them. It's a call to put to death our pride and self-sufficiency and I can do it on my ownishness. It's a healthy self-awareness of our weakness and position as created beings called to serve. There's one commentator on this book who says it in these terms. I love this. I'll quote it for you. It's quite a short quote. Christian humility is realism that recognizes grace. I'll read that again. Christian humility is realism that recognizes grace. It's realism, isn't it? Because it's grounded in the reality of what we're like as people and how often we fumble and fail. But it's realism that recognizes grace because it acknowledges the gift and mercy of God in how he's dealt with us and equipped us to deal with others. We're sinners who've received amazing grace from the God of love. Don't you think that means that we have grace to share with others? And just imagine a community where this principle of Christian humility is embodied. Now, on one hand, would you rather be part of a community where everyone is trying to get ahead for themselves? Everyone is trying to exalt themselves and lord it over the other. They're all trying to find some leverage over someone else that's to show how they're bigger or better or more important or why they can boss them around. Or would you rather be part of a community where everyone looks out for everyone else's interests and seeks to serve them? Which community do you think is more likely to suffer from hunger or poverty or broken hearts or loneliness or disappointment? Now notice as well that in verse 5 still, this humility applies to all of you. Now, verse 5 says, in the same way you who are younger, but then it says all of you. So he says, all right, you young people, submit to your elders, but then he says, all of you, everyone in the room, elders included. In fact, pastors are to be examples of humility, like he says back in verse 3. Here he's addressing elders and youngers. We don't really have a word for that, do we? Whether we are principally shepherds or sheep, we are to be humble. It is to be characteristic of all Christians. And Peter, in another way that reminds us of Philippians 2, quotes from Proverbs to show how important this self-humbling is. God opposes the proud, but shows favour to the humble. It's true, isn't it? Proverbs are proverbs. They're not promises. It's not always a declaration of the way things invariably are, but it's a statement of how things tend to be. And isn't that true? Those who think they've got it beat, those who think that they can do it, those who put themselves above others, they never come to a good end. You can boast and you can be big and strong and you can make something of yourself for a time, But a time comes when your body fails, or the money runs out, or you get caught, and all the dominoes come tumbling down. Those who exalt themselves, more often than not, come to a sticky end. But those who wait on the Lord, those who think of others first, those content to let God be God, they receive favor, they receive grace from God. Will you humble yourselves before one another? Will we humble ourselves before God? Will we know who he is and know who we are? But thirdly, cast yourselves. This is in the second half of verse 6 and verse 7. Cast yourselves. Because this is where submission and humility take us. To a position where we know our own weakness, we know our own inability, and we have no other recourse but to throw ourselves on the mercy of God. Did you notice the turn of phrase that Peter used to justify our self-humbling before God in verse 6? He says, "Humble yourselves therefore under God's mighty hand." Now, I don't know if you're at all familiar with the Old Testament, but that's an Old Testament phrase, under God's mighty hand. It's the language used to describe how God exercised his almighty power to bring Israel out of Egypt. So on one hand, if you'll pardon the pun, God's mighty hand is a reminder of God's greatness, before which we can't but see our humble station. This is a God whose mighty hand could destroy the armies of Pharaoh. This is the God who humbled the gods of Egypt. This is a God of power and glory. This is the God who burned with fire on Sinai. This is a God who is high and exalted and fearsome. But on the other hand, reminding us of God's mighty hand reminds God's people of how the Lord heard his people in distress and he rescued them. Because what was all this drama of the Exodus about, or in response to? Moses going in with a staff and having a showdown with the magicians in Pharaoh's court, and the plagues and the hail and everything that fell on Egypt, and the gods of Egypt were defeated symbolically, and he led them through. All that was in response to the cry of God's people, wasn't it? They called out to the Lord, and it says he remembered them. He heard them, and he remembered them, and he responded. Now, he hadn't forgotten. That's not what it says that, but it's saying his action was a response to their prayers. It was a response to their need and their distress. And they had to be patient, didn't they? They were 400 years in Egypt. And Moses himself had to be patient. He was an old and broken man when he returned to Egypt. We're going to have to preach through Exodus at some point, because that's a great story. We always see, it's the Charlton Heston Moses, isn't it? He's quite, for a fella in his 80s, he looks, quite healthy in that film, doesn't he? He's got big shock of hair, and he's quite, quite lean and athletic. But Moses was an old man. And I think you see, when you analyse as much as we can from what we have in the Bible about him, he seems to be a man who's lost all the confidence and strength that they had as a young man. This man who was so zealous to defend Israel that he would strike down one of the slave drivers. He would murder a man and try and bring Israel's freedom by his own hand. And he would do that, and then he's been, 60 years in the mountains, shepherding, interacting with probably less than 20 people. And so when God says, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh, he says, send someone else. I know I had that education back in Egypt, but I can't remember it. I can't speak. I can't go into the court of the most powerful man on the planet and tell him what to do. Send someone else. He was a broken man. But that was where God had brought him, to where he would use him to bring his people out. And I don't think Moses stays a broken man. I think by the end he's telling Pharaoh, let my people go. The Lord God Almighty says, let my people go. And he's found a strength that he didn't know he had. He's a different man by the end of leading Israel out of Egypt than he was when he went in. God displayed the most incredible power in the Exodus without breaking a sweat, didn't he? He displayed his mighty hand, his sovereign ability to save. And he proved to us, reading it, that when God's people are in distress and cry out to him, he hears them and he will answer and he will keep his promises. We can't know the timing, but we can know the certainty. God opposes the proud, but shows favour to the humble. Those whom the world presses down, God lifts up. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Certain of God's ability to respond, Peter commands us to cast ourselves on him. And that means all our anxiety, all our worries, all the things which distress us. And we get that, I think, with the big stuff. Whether we always have the courage or not to pray about it. But are we concerned that there are some things that God doesn't need to be bothered with? Because he's got a mighty hand, hasn't he? He's involved in bringing a whole people group out of slavery in Egypt. But what about that doctor's appointment I'm worried about? Not because it's like really serious, but it's just like a little thing and I'm, losing a bit of sleep over it because it's just one of those little things that happens. Or what about that difficult conversation at work? Is God really bothered about that? Or that strained relationship with a friend who doesn't like that you're a Christian. And they're not really persecuting you and they're not falling out with you, but it's just like, it's always like a bit of a barrier between you and the conversation gets towards it and you can just feel them getting frosty. Does God care about that? Or what about your hay fever? Or what about your stomach upset? There is no concern too small. There is no trouble too insignificant that a Christian can suffer that God does not care about and is unwilling to deal with. There's nothing that you can bring to him that will cause him to say, don't bother me with that. Cast all your anxiety on him. And Peter doesn't tell us to cast it on him only because he's big enough to deal with it. Because he could have said that. He's like, cast all your anxiety on him because of his mighty hand. And, you've read the Bible, he can deal with it. He tells us to cast it on him because he cares for us. Christians, strange as it might seem, need reminding of God's loving concern for his people. Because we're weak, because we doubt, and because hardship in life can make us doubt or forget it. But will we cast ourselves on God, knowing that he can and will handle it? Submit yourselves. Humble yourselves. Cast yourselves. 3 commands that all come down to pretty much the same thing. Let go and let God. We can't control everything. The more we try and fail, the more anxious we become, because we recognize that the world is not in our control, and that's frightening. But I'll ask you tonight, can you look at the crucified Son of God and know that he died for you? Because if you can, then you can have no doubt that God loves you. This is how we know what love is, that God sent his Son to die for us. And if you know that Jesus died for you and you've received such a gift, do you think that there's anything that you need that God would hold back from you? We need to learn to rely and depend on him in everything. In everything. In every part of our life. In everything we try and do. Even those things that we think, well, that's easy, I can do that. We need to learn to rely on God in that. And we know that there are many things that we can do now that as we get older we will find harder to do. And even some of the simplest things can move beyond our ability. But if we've learnt to submit ourselves and humble ourselves and cast ourselves on the Lord, when these things slip out of our ability or slip out of our control, we will not be thrown in the same way, because we will know the God who cares for us, and we will learn to find peace and rest in him. And when we're troubled and distressed, no matter what it might be by, we can take it to him, knowing that he cares for us. Let's cast ourselves on him. Let's sing our final hymn, 300.